Unless there are any objections from Kate Mathis, our Executive Director, we'll go ahead and launch. Melissa, can you confirm that we're streaming live?
Are now live.
Great, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. This is Katie Crystal speaking, the chair of the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. Welcome to our first meeting of 2021. On January 7th, we are beginning at 7 p.m. on the dot. Given the ongoing COVID-19 public health emergency, we are conducting this meeting electronically, of course. Just wanted to confirm that our commission staff have given notice to the public in order to comply with the procedures and guidelines and the legislation that enables us to meet virtually, and to ensure that commission staff and the public all know about this meeting and can follow along as we are simultaneously being broadcast to the public on YouTube. Just a couple of reminders, as always, if you could mute your microphone when you're not speaking, that helps cut down on background noise. We have a chat function available, which is helpful for any technical difficulties you may be experiencing, but should not be used to conduct business of the commission. And of course, if you could let me know if you're making a motion or seconding a motion, your name. That helps our secretary collect accurate minutes. Before I invite our secretary to call roll, I'm just going to take a second of chair's privilege and note the rather extraordinary events of the past couple of days to say that I very much hope everyone is well and safe in your communities and homes this evening, and in particular, just take a moment to recognize our transit workers, particularly Metro bus operators, Metro rail operators, and those in our systems who faithfully kept our systems running and helped get people out of the District of Columbia safely last night. We are grateful for their work always, especially during this pandemic, and especially for their bravery in doing their job right up until 8 and 9 p.m. respectively last night. Okay, so without further ado, let me invite our secretary to please call the roll. Ms. Gilchrist, over to you.
Chair Crystal.
Here.
Mr. Aguirre.
Present.
Mr. Alcorn.
Here.
Mr. Bell. Ms. Bennett Parker.
Here.
Mr. De Ferranti.
Here.
Mr. Eben.
Here.
Ms. Filler-Korn.
Here.
Mr. Faust.
Here.
Ms. Garvey.
Here.
Mr. Krizik.
Here.
Mr. Letourneau.
Present.
Mr. McKay.
Here.
Mr. Meyer. Ms. Palchik.
Present.
Mr. Reed. Mr. Smedberg. Mr. Snyder.
Here.
Mr. Sullivan.
Here.
Mr. Turner. Mr. Walkinshaw.
Here.
And Mr. Stork is an alternate.
Present.
We have quorum. The following staff are participating in the meeting as well. Executive Director Kate Mathis, Director of Finance and Administration Scott Colcorth, Director of Programs and Policy Alan Fye, NVTC Commission Secretary Rhonda Gilchrist, Web and IT Manager Melissa Walker, WMATA Program Manager Andrew DeVetter, Transit Technology Program Manager Patricia Happ, Program Analyst Matt Cheng, NVTC Legislative Liaison Amy Perrin-Seibert, NVTC Legal Counsel Steve McIsaac, WMATA's Virginia Government Relations Officer Greg Potts, VRE Chief Executive Officer Rich Dalton, VRE Chief Financial Officer Mark Schofield, DRPT Northern Virginia Senior Program Manager Tim Roseboom, as well as our guest speaker Beth Osborne from Transportation for America. I'll turn it back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gilchrist. Great. Thank you all for being with us this evening. I hope everyone has their agenda with them and had an opportunity to review. Just as a brief preview, we'll have a few action items. Action items, of course, include the minutes and meeting summary. We'll have one additional item on the consent agenda, the electronic meeting resolution, which is now as familiar as the back of our hands to everyone. I'm also going to propose a block vote for 4 annual leadership and governance action. So that's the slate of officers for 2021, which we discussed last month. the board appointments for 2021 to the WMATA Board of Directors, the VRE Operations Board, the Virginia Transit Association Board of Directors, committee assignments for 2021, again, which we discussed in December, and the appointment of our new Secretary Treasurer as a signatory and as a pension trustee. We'll also have some action items on VRE's budgets, our fiscal 21 revised and fiscal 22 recommended, as well as the Commission's Northern Virginia Regional Fair Collection Strategic Plan. Other highlights include a brief year in review of an unusual year, to say the least, in 2020 by our Executive Director, Ms. Mathis, and a 2021 outlook by our guest speaker. And we are really excited to welcome Beth Osborne from Transportation for America. We'll have a closed session at the end of our agenda tonight. It shouldn't be too extensive, but we hope that you'll stay with us so that we can maintain quorum, and the rest of our meeting agenda is presented on screen for reference. So moving straight in to the consent agenda, which is the finding the need to conduct this meeting electronically. Of course, part of complying with the enabling legislation that lets us meet electronically during an emergency is to provide an opportunity for comments from the public. So before we have a motion on this, Kate, did we receive any comments from the public for tonight's meeting?
No, Madam Chair, we did not.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so could I have a resolution to find the need to conduct this meeting electronically? Or excuse me, a motion
So
for the
moved,
resolution.
McKay. McKay, so moved.
Second, Sullivan.
All right, moved by Chairman McKay, seconded by Delegate Sullivan. I'm going to go out on a limb, assume there are no comments, but provide a moment nevertheless. Let's go ahead and call the roll on that. Over to you, Ms. Gilchrist.
Chair Crystal.
Aye.
Mr. Gary.
Aye.
Mr. Alcorn.
Aye.
Mr. Bell. Ms. Bennett Parker.
Aye.
Mr. De Ferrenti.
Aye.
Mr. Evan.
Aye.
Ms. Filler Korn.
Aye.
Mr. Faust.
Aye.
Ms. Garvey.
Yes.
Mr. Krizik.
Aye.
Mr. Letourneau.
Aye.
Mr. McKay.
Aye.
Mr. Meyer. Ms. Pelchik.
Aye.
Mr. Reed. Mr. Smedberg. Mr. Snyder? Mr. Snyder?
Aye.
Mr. Sullivan?
Aye.
Mr. Turner? Mr. Walkinshaw?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary.
You didn't ask Mr. Stork? Is that, am I not?
You will not be voting. All of the Fairfax County main commissioners are present, so we don't need you for the votes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
But we are glad that you're here. And I'm sorry, Paul, that was you saying you're voting aye as well? Great.
Yep.
No problem, thank you. Okay. Great. Okay, so our next items are regarding the agenda and the meeting summary. So we do have the minutes from our previous meeting, December 3rd. We've also got a meeting summary from our December 7th joint NVTC PRTC legislative briefing. We were just thrilled to have so many members of the commission join us for what I found to be a really enlightening conversation and hope others benefited from as well. Since I think probably a full quorum of the commission was present, it is helpful for our records to formally approve it for matters of public transparency. So before us, we have the minutes from December 3rd. If I could get a motion to approve those minutes.
So moved, Eben.
Thank you. A second.
Filler Korn, second. Pelchik.
All right, great. Thank you. I'll give it to the speaker, I think in a second earlier. So that has been moved and seconded. Any further discussion about the minutes of December 3rd? Okay, hearing none. Ms. Gilchrist?
Chair Crystal.
Aye.
Mr. Gary.
Aye.
Mr. Alcorn.
Aye.
Mr. Bell.
Aye.
Ms. Bennett Parker.
Aye.
Mr. De Ferrenti.
Aye.
Mr. Eben.
Aye.
Ms. Filler-Korn,
Aye.
Mr. Faust,
Aye.
Ms. Garvey, Mr. Krizik,
Aye.
Mr. Letourneau,
Aye.
Mr. McKay,
Aye.
Mr. Meyer, Ms. Pelchik,
Aye.
Mr. Reed, Mr. Smedberg,
Aye.
Mr. Snyder,
Aye.
Mr. Sullivan,
Aye.
Mr. Turner, Mr. Walkinshaw.
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you. All right, and thanks everyone for bearing with one final roll call vote for at least this portion of our program, which is about that meeting summary again of our joint legislative briefing on December 7th with PRTC. So could I have a motion to approve that meeting summary?
Bell, so moved.
Second.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the second?
Second, Eben.
Evan, thank you very much, Senator Evan. Okay, unless there is any further discussion, let me invite our secretary to call the roll.
Chair Crystal,
Aye.
Mr. Gary,
Aye.
Mr. Elkhorn,
Aye.
Mr. Bell,
Aye.
Ms. Bennett Parker,
Aye.
Mr. De Ferrenti,
Aye.
Mr. Eben, Mr. Eben, Ms. Filler-Korn,
Aye.
Mr. Faust,
Aye.
Ms. Garvey,
Aye.
Mr. Krizik, Mr. Letourneau,
Aye.
Mr. McKay,
Aye.
Mr. Meyer, Ms. Pelchik,
Aye.
Mr. Reed, Mr. Smedberg,
Aye.
Mr. Snyder,
Aye.
Mr. Sullivan,
Aye.
Mr. Turner, Mr. Walkinshaw.
Aye.
And I did get from a chat, Mr. Eben, can you just confirm you voted?
Yes, this is Adam. I vote aye.
Thank you. The motion passes.
Great, thank you. Okay, so before us would be a block vote, or at least I'm proposing it will be. Happy to entertain any concerns about that though. Regarding leadership and governance, so all about transitioning into the new year of 2021, but perhaps not transitioning too much, as we discussed last month. Certainly it's been an unusual year of our virtual meetings that we could forget that we welcomed 10 new commissioners in 2020. So this is still a pretty new group of folks, and we appreciate everyone's commitment to getting to know one another and the work of the commission virtually. And we also recommended that it probably made sense to keep the current slate of officers into 2021. We have one exception. Chairman McKay had generally intended to stick around only for the year, as he has many other responsibilities with VACO and certainly chairing Fairfax County, and so we would be really thrilled to welcome Dalia Palchik as the Secretary Treasurer of the Commission. So we presented this approach to the commissioners at our December 3rd meeting. That would be me continuing as chair, Mr. Kanik Agira of Alexandria continuing as vice chair, and again welcoming Dalia Palchik as Secretary Treasurer. We did invite any concerns to be raised to us or to Ms. Mathis. We're pleased to not receive any, and in fact to receive a couple of comments of support, which we appreciate. And so we are advancing that slate of officers as the executive committee for recommendation tonight. We've also recommended continuity with our appointees to WMATA, as well as to VRE and VTA. So just a quick reminder about that. This commission does determine one of our appointees to the, or one of Virginia's appointees to the board of directors. The other is determined by the Commonwealth. We also choose from among ourselves alternates. And so we are recommending, again, continuing. Paul Smedberg would be the governor's appointee, followed by the alternate, or backed up by the alternate of Mr. Kanik Agira as the WMATA alternate from NVTC. Matt Letourneau would be our Regents designee to the WMATA board, and his alternate would be Walter Alcorn, again, continuing from 2020. To VRE, we are proposing designating Walter Alcorn, Dan Stork, Mr. Walkinshaw from Fairfax County with Mr. McKay as an alternate. And from the city of Alexandria, the new chair of the VRE for 2021, Elizabeth Bennett Parker, and Mr. Aguirre as her alternate. From Arlington County to the VRE, myself, Katie Crystal, and Libby Garvey as an alternate. And then finally to the Virginia Transit Association, to which NVTC does make appointments as well. Dave Snyder and Kate Mathis as principals, Elizabeth Bennett Parker and myself as alternates. While I'm going through the review all at once, I'll finish out by just noting that we'll be recommending as well the continuity of committee membership, essentially keep the appointments that carried us through 2020, including the Executive Committee, the WMATA Committee, the Legend Policy Committee, Program Advisory Committee. You can see the full committee rosters in your meeting materials, and we've tried to post those since December as well. But I would, as chair of the commission, propose to chair the Executive Committee, Mr. Aguirre to chair the WMATA Committee, the Program Advisory Committee to be chaired by David Snyder, and the Legislative and Policy Committee to be chaired by David Meyer. And finally, this is really pretty administrative, but we do need to designate who from NVTC will be the signatories and pension trustees. Essentially, it has always been our custom to name the secretary treasurer as a NVTC signatory and a member of the pension trustees. So this would be confirming Dahlia Palchuk's appointment as the signatory and a trustee of the pension system. So let me pause. That was a lot of information. Long and short of it is keeping most of our leadership roles the same for 2021. Are there any comments or questions about that?
Madam Chair,
Please.
I'm just saying, I think it was a great idea to just kind of hold steady. This has been a crazy year. I think it's just fine, and I appreciate you doing that. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for saying so. I appreciate
Yeah,
it.
thank you. It's a good idea.
Madam Chair,
Yes, please. I think that's Mr. McKay.
I think it's an outstanding plan that I fully support, and as such, I would move approval of action item A.
Excellent.
And
Thank
I'll
you very
second.
much.
Second it, Eileen.
Thank you so much. I wonder if Chairman McKay, would you consider moving as a block vote, A, B, C, and D?
I would be glad to move approval of action items A, B, and C.
Approving of action items A, B, and C in block.
Thank you. Forgive me. Can we squeak D in there as well? As much as I'm sure we would all like to take a second vote on making Dahlia the signatory of the pension trustees.
Katie, I'm reconsidering these officers now.
I'll offer the friendly amendment of adding action item D.
Oh,
Second that friendly amendment.
excellent. Very helpful. Very helpful. As long as it's acceptable to the maker of the motion, I think we've got it on the table.
Indeed it is.
And do we have any further discussion here?
I won't ask the Madam Chair to repeat all the actions that she so well summarized a few minutes ago.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder. All right. Seeing no further questions or comments, I think we are ready for a vote. Over to you, Secretary Gilchrist.
Chair Crystal.
Aye.
Mr. Aguirre. Mr. Alcorn.
Aye.
Mr. Bell.
Aye.
Ms. Bennett Parker.
Aye.
Mr. Dave Ferrenti.
Aye.
Mr. Eben.
Aye.
Ms. Filler-Corn.
Aye.
Mr. Faust.
Aye.
Ms. Garvey.
Aye.
Mr. Krizik.
Aye.
Mr. Letourneau.
Aye.
Mr. McKay.
Aye.
Mr. Meyer. Ms. Palchik.
Aye.
Mr. Reed. Mr. Smedberg.
Aye.
Mr. Snyder.
Aye.
Mr. Sullivan.
Aye.
Mr. Turner. Mr. Walkinshaw.
Aye.
The motion passes.
All right. Thank you all very much. Really looking forward to working with the leadership team and maybe even getting to chair an in-person meeting by the end of 2021, if that's not too much to hope for. All right. So speaking of looking back to 2020 and forward to 2021 at the same time, we have a pair of presentations. The first from our Executive Director, Kate Mathis, who's going to provide an overview of NVTC's accomplishments during 2020. Kate will then introduce our guest speaker. We're just really thrilled to be welcoming Beth Osborne from Transportation from America. As you all will remember, we expressed when we named some of the things we'd like to see on our agenda for 2021. I think we all expressed that we wanted a crystal ball. We wanted to know where transit was heading, whether we could expect any federal relief. Well, we've got at least some good news on that. But I think Kate has done a terrific job lining up someone who perhaps doesn't have a crystal ball, but does have an extraordinarily experienced and interesting view on what may be to come for transit, especially at a time of so much transition across the river. And what that might mean for all of us who feel passionately about advancing transit in our region and beyond. So I'm so glad to have someone who is responding to our desire to get as much information about the future as we can glean. And Kate, let me invite you to begin with the year in review.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I have to say I'm glad to be looking back, and I'm happy to let to Beth handle any of those crystal ball questions. But in all sincerity, I actually am incredibly proud to take this moment to celebrate all the amazing accomplishments of the Commission over the last year, because despite all the stuff that was going on, we really do have a lot to celebrate. So we just hop to the next slide. So indeed, you know, it's really hard to think back just about a year ago when at the beginning of the year, there was the momentum, the General Assembly with, you know, so many of our colleagues here with the passage of the Omnibus Transportation Bill, which was really just fantastic for us and for transit and for transportation in the Commonwealth. But of course, we didn't even have any time to celebrate. By March, you know, the schools and workplaces were shutting down. People were stopping riding transit. Obviously, we've reported to that to you. And the reality being is the loss in revenues from a whole range of sources, in particular fare revenues and the toll revenues that we see within our program became real. And of course, we also had to quickly change how we do our meetings. I mean, now we're sort of pros at this WebEx, but indeed, moving virtually as an organization and as the Commission was a big part of it. And the other thing I get to do over the course of this presentation is actually do some shout outs to the staff because they really did mobilize and do some amazing things this year. So in particular, Melissa Walker, Rhonda Gilchrist, and Matt Frieden were really a big part of us moving towards this virtual platform. So switch to the next slide. So indeed, of course, stepping back, I want to take a moment to recognize our 2020 officers who really did help us staff handle this difficult year while keeping the important work of the Commission moving forward. Really, all four of you helped and really led and shaped our Commission environment and the culture to allow us to continue moving forward and through many of these organizational accomplishments. So next slide. So as Chair Crystal mentioned before, of course, changes to our operations also mean changes to our Commission. Welcoming 10 new commissioners and 1 alternate for an organizational body of 21. As we're talking about, that's, you know, 50% changeover, but absolutely delighted to have 5 new General Assembly members on NVTC. And of course, we do miss those who moved on and vacated these spots, but we're so excited to have all the new faces and energy on our Commission. Next slide. So diving into really the nuts and bolts and mission activities of our work, 2020 continued to be a really strong year for our financial management and our financial performance. Not only did we continue our decades plus long streak with a clean financial statement audits, we managed more than $223 million in funding on behalf of our jurisdictions, more than $25 million in our commuter choice programs, as well as nearly $180 million in funding for VRE. Next slide. Behind the scenes, of course, we also continue to manage the Northern Virginia regional gas tax revenues, other state assistance for our localities, as well as more than $20 million in federal grants for the city of Alexandria and Falls Church. So all told, we manage more than $285 million in funding for our Northern Virginia jurisdictions and transit agencies. And kudos really to our financial management team, Scott Colcorth, Clethia Quarles, and Brittany Sumter for all of their fantastic work. Next slide. So beyond the dollars and cents, a lot of what we do is providing that venue for regional cooperation. So NVTC and our staff connects Northern Virginia's localities, represents the local governments in the larger Washington, D.C. region. And in 2010, this really was a year of accomplishments with this coordination work. So first, focusing on our support for WMATA and our role in helping out our Northern Virginia jurisdictions and have their voice on Metro. Again, we started the year with some history in the commission, appointing the first representative from Loudoun County to the Metro Board of Directors, just as we're looking to expand that silver line next year. And as a staff level, we work to provide a unified Northern Virginia voice to the WMATA board as it managed all through the pandemic and all the ridership challenges. And you'll recall that not that long ago, we completed 2 key reports, one on Virginia's 3% cap, as well as our annual report on the performance and condition of WMATA, really pressing WMATA on strong financial management and improving customer confidence to restore ridership. The teamwork of Alan Fye, Andrew DeVetter, Zach Smith, and Dina Gurma made all of this possible. Next slide. We also led the way in helping our jurisdictions again manage a major shutdown of Virginia Metro rail stations. And going into 2020, we were prepared for the shutdown of 4 Orange Line stations for the second year of Metro's big shutdown for their platform improvement project. But lo and behold, due to the pandemic, what we ended up finding was an additional 5 stations also closed. So NVTC's Matt Chang helped lead and coordinate all the efforts between Metro, our local governments, and other entities like the Pentagon to make sure that the needed shuttle buses and other mitigation plans were in place. Obviously with the pandemic, there weren't as many riders there as there were in 2019 on the blue and yellow lines, but we still needed to move those people. And Matt is also helping prepare for that next shutdown next month, closing Arlington Cemetery Station in the blue line. Next slide. So we've talked a lot about our commuter choice program at several recent meetings. And so a lot of the challenges that have been brought about by the pandemic with uncertainty in revenues, as well as changing travel behaviors. But despite all of that, we were able to move forward on a I-66 corridor program where we did a focus on low cost, low risk projects that really could provide the greatest benefits to our commuters as they return to work. And we're already starting to move out on I-395 for a second round of funding. And so lots of activity going on in this space and really the staff pivoting to deal with some changing realities. And so our commuter choice team is Ben Owen, Jay Watkins, Dina Gurma, Brittany Sumter, Dan Goldfarb, and Alan Fye, again, all working with the support of some consultants to really pivot in this important program. Next slide. So we're going to talk in depth, we have talked in depth about our transit technology program and be presenting our strategic plan this evening. But really the 2 key takeaways for this year was the rollout of the Smart Trip mobile app, where people are actually able to use their watches and their phones to go through at Metro stations. And there was also a lot of movement to upgrade bus fare boxes to make them up to date, greater technology, and a lot of different coordination across the region. Shout out to Patricia Happ, who's really led a vast network of transit system experts from throughout the region, and even including in Maryland, to keep these efforts moving forward, coordinate, and honestly, really optimize to make sure that our transit agencies are able to work closely on all these different technology changes. Next slide. 2020 was also the year that really tested our modeling and analytical staff of our transit resource team. And again, you're going to hear a lot of these names crossing different groups because we very much a matrix organization. But here in particular, Dan Goldfarb really did a lot of work in understanding the impact of COVID-19 on changes in travel behaviors across Northern Virginia and the impact of telework. Matt Chang continued his great work with both Fairfax County and the city of Alexandria through the T-Bus model to help them optimize their bus routes. And Dina Gurma continued to dive into, I should say, and present our regional transit performance through each of our quarterly and annual transit reports. So again, we have a great team that's diving into the numbers and trying to understand the trends. Next slide. So we are only a staff of 16. So indeed, our relationships are a really big part of our success. These are just a sample of the groups that we worked with in the last year. I'm sure there are some that are missing, but really what I wanted to demonstrate is that all of this stuff takes a village, a community, and a region to move forward. And we are very, very fortunate to have wonderful relationships throughout region with national organizations. For example, you're looking forward to a longer term relationship with Transportation for America, because again, there's incredible resources out there that we can use to supplement our staff and help us move forward. Next slide. So it may have seemed that the only news story last year was the pandemic, but we did manage to break through a number of different stories. Most of them were focused on our commuter choice program, changes in tolling, getting things out. But I also had the opportunity several times to talk about the pandemic's impact on transit to both some local and national media outlets. A big shout out to Matt Friedman and Tenley O'Hara, because they are keeping our eyes and ears on the media space, very involved in how we work with the media and with our social media contacts. So thanks to them for all their work. Next slide, thanks. And of course, our ability to actually meet with the community was quite challenging and looked very different. But I do think I will look back on last year, and I really do think a highlight of one of our community engagements was our incredibly well-attended legislative event in December, where we had the honor of both Senator Warner and Senator Kane, Secretary Valentine, Paul Wiedefeld, Rich Dalton, Bob Schneider, and others, for over 160 people joining to learn about the legislative things that were going on. It really was a fantastic event. And, you know, maybe doing things like that online do get some great speakers who normally wouldn't be able to drive down the road or take Metro down the road to meet us. So I think that was a really positive achievement for the year. And as I look to wrap up, you know, our staff were out there on a number of different conferences and activities where we could. We were at ribbon cuttings. And again, our ability to engage, tell the story, share the messages, work with our colleagues was really, really important over this last year. Next slide. We do have some honors and awards that are wonderful. I think it's just so great that in 2020, 2 of our commissioners were recognized for their exceptional work. The American Public Transportation Association gave our longest serving commissioner, Sharon Bulova, the Distinguished Service Award. And then later in the year, George Mason University Star School recognized our past chair, Matt Letourneau, for all of his regional leadership. But of course, I can't go out without saying I'm very proud of the staff for receiving the Outstanding Public Transportation Marketing Award from the Virginia Transit Association for their work on the regional marketing campaign for the previous year, with a big kudos going to Melissa Walker, Matt Friedman, and Jay Watkins on that effort. Next slide. So indeed, a lot happened, a lot to be proud of in 2020. I know Beth's going to talk about sort of the bigger picture, operationalizing. We do have a number of exciting things that we are looking to launch, move out on, and continue in 2021. Just as a sample of some of the things we have going on. But one of the things I do want to highlight is we are looking forward to doing another marketing campaign. It's been a little bit trickier. The timing has been a little bit tough, but we're working very closely with our localities to launch something later this month. I'm very excited to be able to tell more to the commission at our February meeting. But really what it is focusing on amplifying the message of our transit systems are ready, weighty, and want to move forward together with our community to get back on transit. So stay tuned for more in that space. And so what I'd like to do now is transition over to our guest speaker. We'll go to the next slide. There we go. And so I am just absolutely pleased to really start off this 2021 with this special guest who's really knows such an amazing amount of things that are going on around this country with regards to public transportation and transportation as a whole. And so Beth Osborne is the director of Transportation for America, and I've had the pleasure of being able to work with Beth on federal policy issues. And I looked back, and it's over a decade that I've known you, Beth, and I've been able to work with you. And so just a little bit about Beth and her background. She actually, prior to being at T for America, she was at the U.S. Department of Transportation, and she served as the acting assistant secretary for transportation policy, as well as a deputy assistant secretary for transportation policy. And when she was there, she managed a program I think that many of you have heard of, which is the TIGER program, the discretionary grant program that USDOT, it's been renamed to BUILD, but she was right there at the very beginning. She worked on the Secretary's Livability Initiative, which is actually where I had the pleasure of working with her the most, and developed the administration's, that would be the Obama administration's, Surface Transportation Authorization Proposal and the implementation of MAP 21. And before that, she was up on the Hill working for Senator Tom Carper, and has also worked as the policy director at Smart Growth America and worked for the Southern Governors Association. So Beth, I'm going to turn it over to you. We are so excited that you're here.
I'm really excited to be here. It is amazing how long your bio gets as you get older. It used to be much shorter than that. I love mentioning the TIGER program. I'm a New Orleans native and a LSU graduate, and I like to encourage the idea that we named the program TIGER because everyone should be an LSU fan. It's not true, but I just like it. So this has been a tough year, and I am usually the person who people bring into meetings to calm enthusiasm and bring a dose of realism. I'm normally a little bit of a downer on what is possible, just trying to remind people of where the barriers are and then focus us on how to get around them. But these days, I find that people are drowning in realism because of our current predicament and in all parts of our lives. So I'm reversing my traditional role to show people what we have to be enthusiastic about. And the good news is, particularly when it comes to transit, I think we actually have a ton to look forward to, and a lot has actually been accomplished over the last year. So my experience moving to this region a little over 20 years ago was an important part of my personal education on how a transportation system works or doesn't work. I had lived in Baton Rouge while I was in school, where I really struggled to find work I could get to without a car, but I couldn't afford a car because I couldn't get a job. And luckily, I came from a family with enough financial resources that they could pay what is basically it was my cover charge to participate in the economy. I found it really inefficient and terrible policy to require a cover charge for someone to give their talents and labor to the economy, but that is what the majority of the country experiences. But when I moved to this region, starting off living off of the proceeds of selling that car, I found that I had access to all kinds of opportunity because the investment the region had made in high quality transit and in walkability. And that commitment and investment has only grown over the last couple of decades that I've gotten to live here and watch the area progress. And after all this area has accomplished, we ran headfirst into a once in a century pandemic, which I hope we don't have to see in the next century, which turned everything on its head, at least for the time being. It is perfectly understandable that we're staring at the barriers in front of us because people who get involved in organizations like yours tend to be do-gooder overachiever types who are always thinking about what they have left to do and forgetting about what we've accomplished. So that's what I'm going to talk about for a little bit. Many feared that when we saw transit struggling and empty buses and empty trains, that Americans would lose support for transit. They would assume it's unsafe. They would just get used to not using it. They would think others are going to get used to not using it, and it would be hard for transit to recover. So the first question is, did that actually happen? I look to several ballot initiatives over the last year, including some really big ones in Austin and Cincinnati. And in the midst of this emergency, 70% of the ballot initiatives passed. That's exactly in line with previous years when there was no pandemic and no emergency in transit. considering what we've been going for or going through, it would be perfectly understandable and excusable for people to say, let's put a pause on investing in transit. But the overwhelming majority of people did not do that. They said they wanted to put more of their hard-earned money towards transit and that they saw transit as part of their future. We've tested a lot of messages through polling to see if the notion of transit as being out of step with our current times and getting out of the pandemic is dampening people's enthusiasm for transit. And we are not seeing it show up at all. I think to some extent it's seen in people's minds as the getting back to normal, which people are desperate for. At the federal level, when we started 2020, most of us still considered there to be a bright line in what the federal government pays for in transit and what locals in the states pay for. The federal government paid for capital expenses, and the state and local governments were in charge of figuring out the operations. And in past emergencies, we haven't seen much in the way of big investments in transit operations. There's been flexibility given. All right, you might be able to move some of your capital over and give up on your capital program, but not an infusion of operations funding. And very early on in the March, within weeks of the shutdown, there was a large amount of funding, $25 billion that went out to the country for transit systems operating assistance to keep transit running. I didn't hear any of the typical arguments against doing something like that. We didn't hear that it wasn't as necessary in rural areas. In fact, we heard from rural transit that they were going to be the first to go under. And I think the members on Capitol Hill representing rural areas heard that. There was a general understanding for the first time that we all are transit dependent because it doesn't help us to drive to the hospital if the people we need to be there to take care of us couldn't get there themselves. That's a huge change. And that understanding is going to be very helpful moving forward in our conversations about transit in the future. I was particularly struck in the reporting about negotiations over relief bills, how many times people who are part of negotiations in Congress said they hadn't discussed transit yet because that was one of the easy things that they would agree to at the end. Now that is a huge development and a really good thing, not just for transit, but for transportation in general. Now we're seeing efforts to talk about a long-term investment in transit. There's an effort led by Representative Chuy Garcia of Chicago to revisit the traditional 80-20 split between highways and transit and talk about investing in transit at equal levels to highways. It's only taken almost 40 years to have this conversation, but in the midst of a pandemic, there's a growing number of members of Congress that want to have it. And we're in a strong position on transit between the support of voters, the traveling public, and our elected representatives, as we ever have been, really, to ensure that more robust transit is available to Americans. Now, the question is, what does the future bring? When we talk about the future of transit, we have to think about it in terms of the future of our communities and the economy. Transportation, including transit, is a means to an end, and we get ourselves in trouble when we don't recognize that. The big question that is, will people be going places that transit can take them to? And considering the fact that transit most often takes people to work, and there's a lot of evidence that people will not be traveling to work as much, I think it's safe to say that transit cannot wholly rely on the commuter going forward. Of course, transit is supposed to be serving people's convenient, safe, and accessible travel to the things they need. So if more of the things they need to get to are something other than work, then that's the future for transit. But what's really interesting is that the work trip was never the majority of trips. It was the overwhelming majority of our focus in the entire transportation program, but it was only 20 to 30% of our trips at any point. I'll revisit that in a second. I will say that I'd like to take stock of just what I heard at the beginning of your meeting, where Kate and Crystal and others were going through all that you've done over the last year to deal with the pandemic. If someone had asked at this time in 2020, how would your transit system weather a 12 to 15 month pandemic that stopped commuters from commuting? Would you have confidently said, oh, we'll pioneer touch-free fares and rear boarding options and get a quick infusion of cash from the feds and redesign our buses for safer seating and protection of the bus driver? Probably not. But that's exactly what everybody did. And I think that we're going to need to call on that same creativity going forward. So revisiting the point that commute trips were not always, really never should have been the overwhelming focus of transportation. I would point out that those other 80% of trips are the overwhelming majority of the rebound in driving. And one of the reasons there's been such an overwhelming rebound in driving is transit does not serve those trips. I will also say it's a particularly hard weight to bear for transit dependent communities, because if you are just trying to get through your week, you're not just traveling to work, you're trying to get to the grocery store, you're trying to get to the bank, you're trying to get your kids to school. And if transit isn't serving those places as part of your trip chaining, and they're not, you're really having to spend an extraordinary amount of time on transit. I ran an exercise with several officials in the DMV area where we looked at an example family where one parent had gotten hurt and could not participate in family chores or shepherding two kids around to school and daycare. So the other parent was in charge of getting themselves to work and getting one kid to daycare and one kid to school. We picked 3 communities, one in Virginia, one in DC, and one in Maryland, all with good transit. We first did, and I actually went through the research and picked specific addresses and found out which schools they'd be going to, all of that sort of thing. So first we went and found that the parent could get to and from work quite easily by transit in all the neighborhoods. But then we tried to chart a course on transit and or walking and biking for that person to get a kid to daycare, another kid to elementary school, and then to work on time without a car. We had to also then reverse it in the evenings. And part of it was trying to figure out when the schools open, whether or not they have before care and after care, when does the daycare open, where the work is, all of those sorts of things. And what we found was in all 3 neighborhoods, this was almost impossible in the morning and absolutely and completely impossible in the evening. And that's because we've been too focused on the work trip from the beginning. So the pandemic has shown a light on that. We can take this time to reimagine transit so that we supply the other 70 to 80% of trips. In doing that, the state of Virginia is particularly well suited to do this and lead the country in figuring out how to apply access to essential services to its transportation planning. The Virginia Department of Transportation does this exact kind of analysis using a GIS-based access to essential services system that we helped actually to create and to utilize for transportation evaluation. This is something that can allow you to look at how many services people can get to from their homes by all modes of travel. And it can be used to consider transportation changes and investments in all modes, as well as land use changes to see how best to improve that access. So Virginia is a national leader in pioneering the use of this kind of measure. And you could also be a pioneer in using it to determine how to make transit most responsive to the needs of people going into a post-pandemic era. And frankly, I think in doing that, you could pioneer how to have just a better transit system, something we probably always should have had. As we approach the end of the pandemic, or it is in sight, at least, we hope, the question becomes, how do we get people back on transit? And on that, I have a caution about assumptions and a recommendation. A lot of people think that a ton of people bought cars during the pandemic, and once they've done that, they won't go back to transit. I think we're very good in this country at thinking about first order effects, but we forget that first order effects create second and third order effects. If we take a look at what's going on in New York City right now, a whole bunch of people did buy a car, and they're learning how fun it is to park in a city that has too many cars. And a lot of them are deciding that maybe that car investment wasn't the greatest idea in the first place. If we start getting back to normal and a whole bunch of people who weren't driving to work before add themselves to a new kind of normal system of driving to work, there will be a second order effect where people decide that the past commute was awful. The current commute has become even worse, and they don't like spending hours in a commute. So I think that what we need to do is be ready to watch these changes and take advantage. There are a lot of predictions out there about what is and what isn't going to happen. This is my recommendation about filtering them. One, anyone who tells you everything's going to change should be utterly disregarded. Two, anyone who tells you that nothing's going to change should be totally disregarded. So we have a range. The change is going to be someplace between nothing and everything. But it's not going to be nothing and it's not going to be everything. That's all we know right now. But we as transportation leaders should not see ourselves as subject to the whims of the system. We have some influence over this. And this is where we go back to some of the things we just discussed. One, pay attention to the system, to the changes in travel, and be prepared to serve people with a transit roadway system that serves all of their kinds of travel. Two, think about ways to attract people back to transit, both in terms of confidence in the system and the safety of the system, and in providing attractive incentives to pull them back when maybe they get frustrated with other modes of travel, or maybe they decide they want to be back in the workplace a little bit more. And three, recognize that people want transit and use that. There's going to be more response bills and recovery bills that we can utilize to make sure transit gets through this and gives us the time and resources to get people back onto transit. I would expect a supplement to the December relief bill to move pretty early in the new Congress as Senator Schumer takes over as a majority leader. That does not mean an enormous bill, because conservative Democrats will dictate the size and the pace of movement. But it means there will be a vehicle for further relief. I would also be surprised if this Congress and the next administration does not take up a stimulus bill as vaccinations are deployed and the focus on rebuilding the economy occurs. And that's a time where we need to focus on what would be most helpful. In 2009, what we did was throw more money into existing programs. And one thing we should think about right now is, do we just need more funding for the same thing? Or might it be a time to invest in generational improvements that will produce a more modern, productive, equitable, and green transportation system? I bet you can tell from the structure of that question what I think. Recently, we released a proposal for a program that could replace, remove, or reduce the impacts of the urban renewal highways that destroyed minority neighborhoods back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and ensure that those harmed by the initial highways can participate in the benefits of the improvements. That would be a really interesting way to look at a Recovery Act. We have a lot of opportunity going forward and should approach this with the confidence of an industry that has extraordinary support from the traveling public and our elected leaders. This is not 1995 where we have to beg to be included in the conversation. So I say let's act a little bit more like the airline industry that fully expects to get assistance that it needs, and it fully expects to survive. We can walk into this challenge recognizing that transit is needed, wanted, and appreciated as a service. It's just weathering that once-in-a-century disaster that will soon be over. I'm happy to answer any questions about what we're hearing out of Capitol Hill or transition teams and things like that. I will just say that my guesses are informed, but they sadly are not a crystal ball. But I'd be happy to do the best I can.
Well, that would be great. Ms. Osborne, thank you so much for those enlightening and really enjoyable remarks. So we'll throw open the floor for questions. Perhaps while my fellow commissioners are organizing themselves, I'd love to begin with one. One of the things, as I am wrapping my head around the idea of potentially a pro-transit administration and pro-transit House and Senate, or at least willingness to entertain transit, one of the things I think we really live and see a lot of here in Northern Virginia and the DC region is the interconnectivity of land use policy and transportation. And you gave so many great examples about how you need to have transit go places, right? And then we need to have dense enough places or places laid out in such a way that they can be served by transit. And how do you create programs, right, at the federal level? Certainly, I don't think any of us who are local elected officials want the feds getting involved in local land use decisions. But how do you integrate those things in the planning? And as we might see a transportation department that actually is interested in the linkage between transit and land use for climate change reasons, for infrastructure reasons, for housing affordability reasons. How might we see those things play out? Oh, I think you might still be on mute.
Yeah. Sorry. I would first say I don't actually think particularly the change in the Senate does that much more for transit, except I think it does do more for a recovery bill and getting emergency assistance for transit. I think there will be a greater appetite to spend more money to help with recovery. But I really have seen transit take a very bipartisan hold of both sides of the Hill. I would say that it's definitely much stronger on the House side on both sides of the aisle. The Senate seems to just be slower moving and more interested in maintaining the status quo than thinking about any kind of change to the program at all. And that doesn't really change with the Democratic takeover. But in terms of what can be done, there's a lot. Frankly, again, in following in Virginia's footsteps with using access to jobs and access to essential services as your primary measure, you automatically capture land use. And what you do is you show that there's no such thing as any transportation investment that works well in a land use system where everybody lives far from everything they need and everything they need is far from each other. That is a system that if you got the 1,000 smartest engineers in the history of the world together and said, how can you create congestion with the fewest number of people? That is the system you would create. So starting by giving people the tools to see that and to see the lack of effectiveness of that system makes it impossible to justify big expenditures without matching land use policy. And land use policy is hard to change. But if you can show why you're changing it and what people get for it, it becomes a little bit easier. And this is true on the transit and the highway side. Both are befuddled and inefficient with poor land use decisions around it. So I think giving people the tools to see that is step number one. And also there are a lot of tools that we're using right now that don't factor in land use in any way, shape, or form that could. So for example, a lot of our models that look at how to design roadways and what can reduce congestion don't consider the effects of induced demand. Once you quantify induced demand, a lot of what induces the demand is the expansion itself, but what is induced by that is development that is further afield, which fills it up. And you get to see that when you start actually calculating it. So a lot of it is just good tools, good information, instead of the best that 1950s engineers could produce. And God bless them, they did the best that they could with the tools and the information they had in the 1950s. But shame on us to still be using 70-year-old tools in the 2020s.
Thank you. All right, colleagues, fellow commissioners, questions? Oh, Ms. Garvey, I see there with a hand up.
Yeah, I can't. I'm looking for how to put up a hand, and I can't find it. So, yeah,
sure, I'm there.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you for taking the positive take. We could all use that.
It's every now and then.
Yeah. So you said something I'd like you to just talk about a little bit more, and that is, which we have some of that going on right here in Arlington. We've kind of which I was talking about just today with our staff, and that's the 60s, 70s, 80s highways that just destroyed minority neighborhoods or cut them off, cut them in half. And you said, let's fix that. Could you talk about a little bit about how to fix that? Because there's so much already built now that.
So true.
Yeah. So
no, you're right. And going back and fixing something after decades and the whole built environment building up around it, it's a difficult thing to tease apart. I will tell it through the lens of the experience that I paid the most attention to. I mentioned I'm from New Orleans, and when I was at USDOT running the Tiger program, we gave the city of New Orleans a planning grant to look at taking down the Claiborne Expressway, which was built down Claiborne Boulevard, which separates the French Quarter from Treme. And it's an elevated expressway, which is basically about 6 lanes wide. And it was put through a Black neighborhood that was actually a middle and upper class, really beautiful, prominent neighborhood with nice sized homes and just this incredible canopy of oak trees with Spanish moss. And it just decimated the community. It's starting to come back now, but it's been a very, very slow process. And when they did the planning grant, they ran into 2 problems. One, going back to tools, the models we use are programmed to assume that no trip will ever go away. So what's happened today couldn't possibly happen, because if a trip existed, it couldn't possibly not exist in the future. 2 is it must reassign a trip in a corridor to the corridor. So if Claiborne Expressway came down, the model is forced to assume that if people don't fit on the new boulevard, that they'll drive through the neighborhoods, which are made up of potholes that are big enough to engulf your car, something the New Orleans should probably fix. But you're not going to go more than about 10 or 15 miles per hour down those roadways. And the model assumes that that's a logical decision, is that you'll get off the 55 mile per hour elevated expressway and go through a terribly designed network of local roads that you can't go quickly on, and many of which switch one way back and forth all the way up and down the road. The model can only do what it's programmed to do. So one, give them the tools so they can actually see what might truly happen with the traffic, so that you don't scare everyone into thinking that their local roads are going to be overrun with people coming through. The second big problem they ran into is the very people who feared that, or the very people who were harmed by the initial highway feared that they would be displaced by the increased property value of fixing the thing that destroyed their community in the first place, which is the description of a Greek-style tragedy, in my opinion. And so I think if we're going to go in, we need to provide a good amount of money, because it's a lot of jobs and time and money to take these things down and redesign them. We need to go in with models that can help people make legitimate decisions on what are the alternatives. And we have to have a land trust system in place to make sure that the people who live in the neighborhood have the ability to buy and own their property and benefit from the investment in a way that helps to rebuild the generational wealth that they lost. And so that's kind of the idea that we put together. And we have a handful of places to look at for guidance, including Syracuse is doing this now. Rochester did an incredible job taking the inner loop up to grade and recovering a ton of land for development. Here in Washington, D.C., down by Georgetown Law, we've capped a highway and rebuilt over it. So it's not like nobody's done this before. We've got older examples from New York, from Portland, from Milwaukee. And so I think that there are leaders out there that we can turn to see how they did it. But it's a hard thing to do, period. And it's a really impossible thing to do with tools that tell you falsehoods and threats to not going in, ensuring the neighborhood that you have a system in place to make sure they benefit from the improvement in their area.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Sure.
Thank you. Other questions? Thoughts? All right.
Actually, Madam Chair, I just wanted to say hello to my friend Beth. It's been many years.
No. I was actually going to text you to say hello. We worked in the Hall of States.
I already did. So that was back in long time ago, let's just say. But it's great to see you. Thanks for for sharing your expertise and for also your positive message.
Thank you. It's great to see you.
Appreciate it. It's great to see you.
Fabulous. Thank you. Okay. I don't think I see any other hands. Folks should feel free to jump in if I've just missed your signal. If not, thank you so much for joining us. That was a really energizing presentation, and can't wait to have you come back and we can reflect on whether the things about which we were hopeful panned out.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it, and I've taken to adjusting the last line in the Passover Seder next year in Jerusalem to say next year in person. This year in person. I hope to get to see you all in person in the near future.
I think we hope so as well. We appreciate it.
Take care.
Excellent. All right. Well, I know that Mr. Smedberg and Mr. Letourneau have just as dazzling and positive a presentation for us about the outlook facing the facing WMATA. So I'm going to welcome them to give their WMATA board member report, to talk about COVID response, the general report of the board members, and other WMATA news, of which there's a lot. It's been an eventful couple of weeks. So we will, if there are immediate questions for the two of them, we can take those and then bring it to Mr. Aguirre, the chair of our WMATA committee, to give his report. So let's start with Paul and Matt to
Madam Chair, Madam Chair, this is Senator Bell. Can I say something real quick?
Sure.
Yeah, as we get into this, I've asked before in a couple of meetings about public messaging on the safety and response of Metro. And I just wanted to give a shout out. I've seen the public service announcement commercials several times. I think they're extremely well done. And it shows some of the many actions that are being taken to make things safe. And I want to say thank you to those who made that happen. And I think that's what's going to be needed to help us get back on track. So thank you very much.
Great. Senator, I'm really glad to hear those are reaching you. That's excellent. All right. Well, on that positive note, Mr. Smedberg, Ms. Letourneau, who'd like to go first?
I will, Madam Chair. And unfortunately, we may be letting you down here a bit. I'm not sure how uplifting or how...
I think you had a hard act to follow.
This presentation will be.
But Senator Bell just set you up for success there. So
There you go. And it will be brief in the sense of prior presentations, just because of where we are right now and with some notes. But Matt and I did want to highlight the group, and he's obviously going to chime in here as well. But before we get into the fiscal year 21-22 budget issue, just to highlight a few things that we did at our last board meeting. The Metro Board adopted updated Metro service guidelines for bus. We approved some station name changes in Virginia and Maryland. And we executed a joint agreement at the West Falls Church Station. And there was a lot of collaboration, obviously, with the county of Fairfax on that. So some items we did want to highlight for. So last month, the board did a hearing on the GM's fiscal year 22 budget and the 22 through 20 capital budget. So we'll be going into that public period beginning at around the end of February. So February through the first part of March. It does take time to get all the documents together, and we're not meeting until next week to give to some sort of outline or budget guidance. Because, like I said earlier, there's a lot to be worked out yet. We are to fiscal year 22 with a sizable budget. We were fortunate to get some additional dollars during this last round of Congress. We're approximately, the entire region received, and the we're still, again, waiting for the detail that has yet to be issued by FTA. But we're looking at about $830 million for the region. 720 would come to WMATA. Of that, as you know, we have to we act as sort of an agent for the localities that can't directly accept the federal dollars. That total, and so that brings potential overall dollar amount down to about 610. But given where we were in 21 with a gap of 176 million and a much larger, very sizable gap for 22, obviously those dollars are extremely helpful. and will help us, manage things. But it still, isn't going to be quite enough to offset everything. As you know, ridership is way down, and through various agreements and everything, there are a lot of operational costs. We got people on board, so that was part of the, I think, expectation, certainly in CARES 1, and will likely be an expectation to some degree in CARES 2, if you will. So it's and just so people know, I know we have a lot of new folks. The money that WMATA received, we push out to the locale or to the agencies in the region. It's DRE, the PRTC, MTA, and Ride-On are the main recipients of that. So, the board is still discussing and working with the general manager and his team, his financial team, on how best to move forward with those dollars. And, the areas that we'll ultimately focus on. I think it's fair to say there are some areas, obviously, the employee issue, the number of employees, layoffs, actual percent subsidy issue, raises, those are on the table and being debated as they were in 21. So we have a lot of work to do. As Matt can attest, it's very complicated and a very spirited debate that we have, and a lot of competing interests, and not only internally for WMATA, but also regionally between the three jurisdictions. So, but things are going out, pretty well, and I think next week we'll have much more information. We're getting an indication that FTA will be releasing more detailed information next week. We're hoping so anyway, so we have a better sense of what it is, if there are any particular, moving forward with that second tranche of money. So pretty open-ended specifics at this point that we can really, bring forward at this point, because we're still, working with the general manager and his financial team, to come to some agreement on what a good framework would be to move forward. And as someone mentioned, we're not going to get out of this in 1 year, and this money does not, while it's extremely helpful and we're very grateful, it doesn't solve the issue. What is ridership going to look like? What is telecommuting going to look like for this region? How are people going to use Metro, and particularly Metro Rail that basically pays the bills, going to look like in the future? And, how long will to, get to a model and adjust to all those different changes? And there. So, Matt, anything?
Yeah, a couple things. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank Katie for recognizing the Metro employees up front. And I know, Paul, you and I have talked over the last few days. Metro Transit Police was part of the law enforcement response yesterday as well. And certainly, as you can imagine, we had lots of transit employees, Metro employees on the front lines in the middle of all this chaos. Who are able to keep the system running. So both of us are appreciative of that. And the board had some communication about how those things were going and some of the decisions that had to be made to keep the system running. And obviously over the next 13, 14 days or so, we'll continue to be involved in those kind of issues. Maybe just to kind of give you just broad brush sort of some of the issues that you'll probably hear some discussion about as we move forward. As Paul said, we're still working out a lot of these details. Kind of a big one is sort of how much of the funding to apply and when. It's kind of interesting the comment that the last speaker made comparing transit more to the airline industry. And their approach for receiving aid has been basically to just use it, and then it's going to run out at a certain point, and then you got to go back and get more. And so, Metro could take more of that approach and, maintain a certain level of service and avoid layoffs. The risk of that is the money runs out sooner. And so if there is not aid that's forthcoming at a certain point in time, then we're going to be back to the type of scenarios that you heard about, which was kind of the doomsday budget scenarios. And it probably wouldn't be that bad, but it wouldn't be things that we would want to see. So that's one kind of macro issue that the board's going to have to weigh during the budget process. In terms of sort of issues that I think will be points of discussion, one of them I talked about last month was this notion of using, essentially moving operating or using operating funds for debt, essentially selling debt to fund operating. I had that other way around. What Metro originally was going to do as part of that doomsday scenario was save $160 million by effectively issuing debt to cover expenses that would be preventive maintenance and part of the operating budget. And that's a practice that I think all of us in Northern Virginia studiously avoid in our local governments. And I think it's something that there is a lot of concern about. I have a lot of concern about, and Paul does as well. And there are different viewpoints about that on the Metro board. And I think that will be something, the impact of not doing that potentially could be less service, and it could be, potentially some layoffs. On the other hand, if you move a significant amount of money over, then you are paying interest for things that you shouldn't be paying interest for, and you're reducing your ability to have capital expenditures in the future, including on the state of good repair projects that really was the impetus for all of us going out and getting dedicated funding in the first place. And so, I don't think, we did all of that, and we didn't go to the General Assembly, and then they didn't do all their work so that Metro could then start issuing debt to pay for operating costs. So that's a real concern. And I think now that there is federal money coming in, I think it's something that could and should be avoided to the greatest extent possible. But there are different viewpoints on that issue. And then Silverline Phase 2, we know at this point it's likely not going to be starting in July. We're waiting for the Airports Authority to give us an official designation. But at the Safety and Operations Committee recently, there was a pretty extensive presentation that talked about the ongoing issues that exist in that project and the likelihood that even now, from a construction standpoint, the project wouldn't be turned over to Metro in time to start in July, which will mean, some type of delay further into the next fiscal year. There's a cost savings associated to that, but there are some that continue to question whether we should be opening new service in this environment. And again, that's not a point of view I agree with at all, but it is a point of view that is out there, and I think you will see some discussion about on the Metro board during the budget process, and we're certainly going to want, I think, this region to weigh in on that issue. And then finally, as Paul said, the 3%, sort of cap that we have. I think, as a local government person, my viewpoint is that Metro did receive federal assistance and all the local governments did not. And so to the greatest extent possible, we should avoid, I think, charging the extra up to 3% in the cap subsidy increases for FY22 if we can. I think, again, that's a conversation we all need to have about how much we're funding and what exactly that budget looks like. But I know the pressures that all the local governments are under. So those are just kind of some of the issues that are out there. And as Paul said, we can't really answer definitively any of those questions, but you will see the board, take action next week on sort of the parameters of what the discussion is going to be for the budget. And then there'll be a public input process and several board work sessions to work through that budget.
And Katie, working with Tim and Dr. Mitchell office on various aspects of where we think the may not be going. Also working with Governor Hogan's office, side, Dr. Reed in the district. So, just understand, where they're coming from and how best we can all work together to come up with some compromise, next week that's going to be agreeable to everyone and best serves not only the authority, but, the region, because, we want to be there for the recovery. We know it's important, all the investment that this region and the Commonwealth has made. And, we want WMATA to be the best system it can be as we work our way through this. So.
Thank you. Okay. Let's open the floor for questions from commissioners. No need to put up a hand, but if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself as you ask your question, I think that'd be helpful.
Chair Crystal, it's Mike Turner with Loudoun County. I have a quick question.
Yes, please.
Matt or Paul, either one of you, I'm missing a key piece here somewhere. When I first heard this, I'm missing the piece. So if this is a dumb question, I apologize. If we're getting funding through the stimulus package to Metro, why are we talking about using debt financing for operations? I'm confused about that. What am I missing?
Well, because the funding that Metro is getting is still not enough to avoid all service cuts and layoffs. And so the question is to avoid at least some, we're going to go to a February service plan that we've all kind of known about for some time, which was our FY21 adjustment. I think the goal would be to try to continue that level of service, which is roughly 80% of the system, into fiscal year 22. Even if we did that, if you look at all the other things that Metro has to fund, we have a collective bargaining agreement that requires us to give employees raises, those kinds of things. We wouldn't be able to last the entire year at our projected revenue numbers, even with that federal dollars at that level of service. And so in order to close that gap, one option that's on the table is to do what I discussed and move some money over and start, issuing debt for some of those operating costs. Again, that's not a good practice. I think, a lot of systems in the past have done that. Metro has done that in the past, and that kind of contributed to where we ended up as a system. And so I think that should be avoided to the greatest extent possible. But there are different viewpoints on whether it's worth a trade-off for service or for layoffs or things like that. And, we don't know exactly yet what that equation would look like and how long service can be funded for. But it is worth saying, this stimulus that just passed is not going to completely solve our problems for fiscal year 22. There's not enough money there, and our revenue hole is too deep. And then, as Paul said, it's likely not just the 22 problem either. So, it's just a little bit more complicated, and that's why something like that's being put on the table. I think generally management would agree that that's not something we should do if we can avoid it.
And Mr. Turner, as it relates specifically to preventative maintenance, it was a lot of new folks. It was one of the issues that, or was one of the arguments to get dedicated funding, particularly in Maryland and Virginia. And this board is committed to not making the mistakes that I think some of the prior Metro boards had made in the past, where they stepped the path of putting off preventative maintenance, putting off various capital projects, which created this whole spiral downward to where Metro ended up just 5 years and just before Paul Wiedefeld got there. And now there's the whole rebuilding back, and we don't want to lose that momentum. And we still have significant issues to address in that area, safety issues with the Safety Commission, with FTA and others. So we don't want that to be pushed aside. I mean, and I'm sure you've seen it as an elected, a lot of times, when push comes to shove, it's easy to take money away from the capital budget or not paying roads or doing preventative maintenance because prices really fight to as we can without having to issue debt.
If I can just make a quick comment, and it's a philosophical discussion, and I completely get the the horrible choices that the Metro Board has to make. And I absolutely agree with the fiscally responsible objective of not using debt financing to finance operations. I get that. And I also get that we don't want to go down the slippery slope that we found Metro in prior years. That makes perfect sense. I get that too. The only thing I would feed into that decision-making process is this is such an extraordinary time that we're really in this horrible choice, this King Solomon choice of having to not go down the path that we went down to in the past with Metro and destroying families on the other side. I mean, that's really the stakes of the game as this goes on. Yeah, I know Metro should not be a jobs program, but it's not quite that simple. These really are extraordinary times, and this is really having an extraordinary human impact. And so it's not as clear cut for me as it might have been under another circumstance. The stakes of the game on both sides are really, really pretty severe. And I know you guys know that. I really do. I wouldn't want to be in your shoes at all for these kinds of discussions. It's just, it's easy to say, well, yeah, we're just keeping people in jobs where we don't need them. And why would we do that? It doesn't make any business sense. No, but it might make a human sense here over the next 6 months. We don't know where this is going to go. That's obviously not sustainable. It's just, it's not as easy a decision as it might be under different circumstances. It's just a philosophical point.
Yeah, and I think one thing that will help with that, I mean, we've been asking for information that we haven't really gotten yet, that we will have as part of the budget process, that helps us understand our overall debt profile. And, in our local governments, and Mike, you and I are in the same one, we have a capital program, a 6-year capital program. And over those 6 years, we can look and see what our projections are for how much debt we have to issue, what our debt service we have to cover is, how much cash we're paying, and, where our grant situation is. We haven't really seen those numbers for Metro. And so it's hard to evaluate what the impact of doing something like this without understanding that full picture. And that's something that, we've asked for and we anticipate will be part of that decision-making process.
That's good. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks for the good line of questioning, Mr. Turner. Other questions for Omada reps?
Madam Chair, could Senator Bell?
Senator Bell, please.
Yeah, this might be a difficult one, so maybe a 50,000-foot answer would be good. Can you just briefly talk about the assumptions that were made on ridership coming back or revenues? And thanks for the good work y'all have done on this. I know this is difficult, and these are gut-wrenching decisions, as Mike was pointing out. But any light you could shed on that? And frankly, if you went conservative or if the estimates were conservative, I would completely understand that approach. Thank you.
Well, as with anything with the Metro Board, even that is under debate. There are some folks that think come July 1st, people are going to be rushing back. Everyone's had a vaccine, and here we go. Metro is in constant government with the Defense Department, the other large employers in the region, agencies and directors who are some information. We're not expecting well, let's put it this way, a very gradual return, Senator Bell, I think, to transit potentially. I think that
so Senator Bell, I
approach to that, and
there are specific numbers, but I think broadly speaking, the direction that we gave was pretty conservative, and it also accounted for an increase through the fiscal year in 22. Assuming that more people would be coming back as time went on. The problem is you sort of have to solve for the biggest problem first, which is the low ridership point, which is happening, as we roll into the new fiscal year in July. So I don't have the exacts. I'm not gonna be able to find them right now, but we did have, as Paul said, quite a bit of debate about exactly what those numbers should be. They're based on, I think, as good a science as you can have at this point, which is, what the ridership pattern has been, what the intelligence is from the employers, private and public, that Metro is dealing with. It does anticipate some recovery. Bus is much higher than rail as it is today, and so we anticipate significantly higher bus ridership. But I can always talk to you offline about some of the details here once I find them. But
Madam Chair, Paul, thank
you. Senator Bell, we won't be back to 19 level because we're seeing quite a healthy increase in ridership, and Metro is achieving some pretty high levels of ridership just prior to the pandemic. It's unlikely that we'll be at those levels for any time soon.
Thank you. Senator Bell, I think you're back on mute. Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm hitting the button too quick. Thanks, Madam Chair. Paul, Matt, thank you for great information. I know this is a difficult one, and frankly, the best guesstimates backed by all the science, it's still very difficult. But not to borrow the term flatten the curve, but anything we can do at this point, obviously, to try to get people back to the new norm and up those ridership numbers obviously makes the reality of cuts less severe. So, but I appreciate the difficulty of this, but I always think it's important to know those assumptions that are the basis for those kind of decisions. Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you.
And I had quite a bit planned for us as a board, and obviously it's all been thrown out the window because of this, but we are starting to talk about things like that already as people start to come back, and universities and schools and other things will start coming back. So,
Paul, do you think the reinstitution of fare payment on bus is going to have any kind of meaningful impact, or that's just never been a big driver of revenue?
Yeah, anyway. I mean, bottom line, Katie, it just in general, rail pays. Bottom line, the recovery rate on the bus is very low, and it's rail that pays the bills. So that's it's great that people are riding the bus,
right?
And that Metro has been able to provide that service because a lot of them are essential workers, a lot of them are transit dependent. We'll likely have to make adjustments to provide extra service for the demand we're seeing in certain areas, but it's rail that.
Yeah.
I think it's a couple $1 million that we are assuming we just reinstituted it. So from this point forward, I think it's again, I don't have the exact number in front of me. There is a number. I think it was something in the neighborhood of like $3 to $5 million that it brings back. And I mean that at this point in time, every bit of revenue helps. So
yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful. Others have questions.
Madam Chair, Dave.
Please, Mr. Snyder, and then we'll go to Chairman McKay.
Oh, sure.
No, please, Mr. Snyder. I think you got in there first.
Okay, thank you. First, a comment. In addition to what we all witnessed at the Capitol yesterday, I used Metro yesterday to get down to our church, which is kind of in the middle of DC, and sort of a security thing. But I noticed that a huge number of the protesters weren't wearing masks in the system. And I just want to say how appalling, in addition to everything else that was occurring, how clear Metro is with their verbal and their written messages. And yet I saw at least people dressed as Trump protesters deliberately not wearing masks in large numbers. So I just want to make a statement that I appreciated the employees continuing to provide service in frankly, in a very diplomatic way. So hats off to the employees for that. The more on point, two points as a regular rider I want to make. First of all, shutting down stations is a really bad idea, particularly if you're like Falls Church, where there are really two stations we use, and the reaction is just not going to be good for me locally, but I think for the system to be shutting down 19 stations. The second thing that I think is a really bad idea is headways as long as 30 minutes, because at that point, people are not going to wait 30 minutes. Now, if you talk about 10, 12, 15, at least in my view, that's something people don't like it, they don't want it, but it's somewhat reasonable. So I would just make those key points about shutting down the stations in a headway. Anything near 30 minutes, it seems to me, would further discourage riders who want to get back to the rail system. So if you have any comments, I'd appreciate to take them or just hear what you had to say in response. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, David. And obviously, the service, the headways has been a big source of debate, and we've already received a lot of comments and all the station closures as well. So, we're again working with the general manager on a whole host of issues, and both of those are definitely on that list. And and just not to drag this out too. The employees yesterday, including from the general manager, I don't think people goes on just staff structure and the District of Columbia and the federal government and the Secret Service and the FBI. There's constant was an extreme from 3 or 4 times general manager and just and they really did the best they could given the circumstances, and it was handled a little bit as you can imagine in certain stations, and but top of mind was the safety of the employees, and the work that they were having yesterday was really extraordinary. So, yeah, very challenging.
All right. I think I had Jeff coming in next with a question. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Madam Chair. It's actually a couple comments. First, just piling on with what Paul just said, I do want to give a special shout out to the Metro Transit Police in particular. Having communicated with our police and had pretty big concerns about some of our stations, the volume of cars that were still in them. The fact that many of the people who were down in the district were staying in hotels in our jurisdictions and at the end of the line in a lot of cases where there was high volumes of people. And so they really did an exceptional job. And frankly, notwithstanding what happened at the Capitol, our regional network really worked well, all things considered. And I think that's one thing we can be grateful for. Just 2 comments. One, I appreciate Paul and Matt's emphasis on the new service, particularly opening of the Silver Line. Paul just said a minute ago, rail pays the bills. Bus is critical in getting a lot of people to the rail and getting them around otherwise. But if we're really going to help with the bills part, help people get excited about riding transit again, delaying any further, opening, the Silver Line, which has potential to carry a ton of people, and really start to help reopen, a big part of our economy in Tysons and Fairfax County, I think would be a poor mistake. And I look forward to working with our WMATA reps and activating people and getting them involved in this process, because I know that that line may not be of great criticality to the rest of the WMATA board. It is critical to Virginia, and I think one of the things WMATA needs to understand is the potential revenue benefits of getting that line up and opening, and really the excitement of getting people back in our system. And so I'm going to rely on our WMATA board members to help us understand when the right time to activate that is. And I appreciate Supervisor Alcorn's work with as an alternate on this as well, because it's critical. And then lastly, I never think it's too early for WMATA, and I'm sure they are already doing this, to help pave a way and build a good relationship with the new administration. We now know, we're going to have a new Secretary of Transportation, and I'm just wondering what, if any, efforts are being made by senior folks at WMATA to work with and get early appointments and in front of some of these key members of the new administration, to just really emphasize the fact that even with the stimulus money that we just heard about, we are far from solving WMATA's problem in the short term, much less the long term. And so, I certainly would hope that we would be making the case that despite that help, we are not out of the woods by any means. And if we're going to return to any level of normalcy, and including our federal employees, any level of normalcy, it's going to be dependent upon Metro up and running full steam. And so I'm hoping we're already working on that. If not, we really need to step that up and be ready to go and build those relationships as soon as we can.
Why don't I take the first part, and then Paul, why don't you take the second part?
Yeah.
On the silver line, Jeff, you couldn't be more correct, and that's as you know, that's exactly how I feel, and I have expressed many times, as Paul can attest, and Paul, of course, does as well. But sometimes taking some flack for with my Metro Board colleagues. But I am certainly willing to roll up my hands on that issue. It is a huge priority for Virginia, obviously, to Loudoun and to Fairfax. But I think we have. For instance, in Loudoun, we have 3,000 new federal employees moving to an Ashburn location starting this quarter who are expecting to take Metro to get there. Obviously, we won't necessarily be able to, they're going to be phased in through the course of the year, but we may not be able to get there on day one, but that's important. And so, those type of deals and that type of economic development is occurring all throughout the Dulles corridor. And, I think that's a growth opportunity for Metro. And so as we talk about an economic recovery, which we all care about, to sort of, ramp that down after the type of investment that all of us have made and the type of planning that's gone into that would be a really big mistake. So that's certainly where we're coming from and, what we're going to fight for on the board. And I know, on the second question, there's a lot going on. Paul, why don't you?
Yeah. And Jeff, Matt really had, let him take the lead. So state on the silver line, and Matt in particular is good job at that for you all. And in contact with folks, Paul is part of the small group. There's a group of transit leaders that are in regular contact, not only with the current administration, but with people who will likely be playing roles in the new administration or will be advising, playing policy roles. He's been very active, and Metro in general has been very active with the federal delegation, as you know, and Regina and Greg have obviously the people are starting the process. So we have someone on the board who was on the transition team, the actual transition group, who has a great say of the things happening and how things are contact. I'm in regular contact with that person, as is the general manager. So, starting to lay the groundwork for that outreach.
Great, thank you, Paul. I see Libby Garvey next, followed by Matt DeFerranti.
Thank you, Katie. So let me see, just two things real quickly. I think Jeff and our Metro folks are making good points about the silver line, and maybe it would be penny wise and pound foolish not to push forward for that. So I totally get that. I wanted to build a little bit on the comment about everything that the transit workers did yesterday and what they went through. Would it be appropriate for Ms. Crystal, you as our chair, to perhaps send some kind of a letter of commendation or a public letter or some kind of letter to the editor commending transit workers and what they did to help this region? I see two goals: one, to simply thank them and let them know they're appreciated, but two, to kind of just put in front of the public, make it more of a public facing transit and what transit does for people. And they're kind of part of our not first responders, but frontline workers. And that may just help, burnish the transit the transit opinion among our public that might be kind of forgetting about transit. So anyway, I'd like to suggest that.
I'd be happy to talk with Ms. Letourneau and Mr. Schmidberg about sort of the most productive way for the commission to get involved there.
Just a suggestion. Thank you.
That's a great idea. Absolutely. Mr. DeFrente, I think, had next.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. It's just a quick question, kind of on to the extent we know the federal legislation. What I heard was 176 million for fiscal year 21 as the deficit, and then it looks to me as though we're 20% short or maybe 30% short for fiscal year 22. And I guess the question is just, am I right that the first, federal legislation allows for the use of immediately of the funds to try and address fiscal year 21? I don't know whether Paul or Matt, you're able to speak at that high level. I don't want to get too in the weeds, but I'm trying to get an understanding of the scale of the challenge for this fiscal year and the next one.
So yeah, I think it does. Go ahead, Paul, if you want.
No.
Okay. Yeah, we can. So I think the idea is to help stabilize 21, particularly on the layoff side. That was something that was on the table, even with the adjusted plan. And then for 22, I think the debate will be how much of it do you apply? Because if you applied all of it, it will only last you a certain period of time, and then you're going to run out. Versus, do you cut service further and make that money last longer? And that is, I think, sort of a not just philosophical, but also something that we need more situational awareness on in terms of where the administration is going to be, what the prospects are for more funding, all those kinds of things, which we do have a little time since we're not adopting this until March. But I think that will be kind of the issue. The other thing, when you look at sort of those gaps, is, the original kind of doomsday scenario also included 160 million of that preventive maintenance getting moved over. Which, I think, as Paul said, we would both like to see that number down considerably. So that does change what that number you're trying to solve for is a little bit too. So I think in a few weeks, we'll probably have better numbers for you as to exactly what the problem we're trying to solve for is. But there's going to be probably several different approaches to solving it that need to be on the table. And then as time goes on, we understand a little better what's happening out there, what revenue is, and so on. We can, potentially pick one of those options or some combination thereof to sort of arrive at something that tries to avoid some of those really terrible things like the station closures and the really long headways that Mr. Snyder talked about, but maybe isn't quite the level of service we would like to see. As kind of a compromise. So that, but we'll just kind of have to see.
Complicated, a complicating factor is Matt is, been out, as Matt said, 21. You then increase expenses for 22 that we hadn't planned on. So you have your original gap, and you add expenses. So you have to address. Now, that's fine, but yet it creates a whole new set of challenges. And that's some of what we're, trying to work out now.
Thank you both.
Paul. I think I saw Delegate Krizik trying to get in. Was that right? No, somebody else. Okay. All right. Was it, all right. I'm sorry. Cut off. I thought there was another voice trying to get in there. Okay. Well, thank you. And I think this sort of recurrent uncertainty about the budget really is indicative of the need for more information, more debate ahead as we all try to process what these federal funds could mean. Well, thank you both. In the interest of time, I am going to encourage that we move on to Councilman Aguirre, who is the chair of our WMATA committee, for a brief report from the committee. So over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be very brief since the committee has not met in the last few months. We will, however, be meeting, I believe, on the 21st at 6 p.m. And as always, all are welcome. We will be discussing the WMATA GM CEO's proposed FY22 budget And we will also be going over any comments to be relayed to the commission for approval at its February commission meeting. And just as a point of personal privilege, I also had the opportunity to stop the Potomac Yard Metro Station construction site again. And considering the year that we've been having, we are still making great progress and on track, and things are looking great. So just wanted to share that as well. Thank you.
Thanks for the spot of good news. All right. Okay, so I think we will move on from WMATA, but I'll pause for any final rounds of questions. Okay, great. So certainly related is an update on the transit technology program that will be followed by a vote on the strategic plan. So Ms. Mathis, let me turn it over to you to introduce our program manager in this area of work.
Well, absolutely. Thank you, Madam Chair. And indeed, staff are seeking the Commission's acceptance of the proposed 2021 Northern Virginia Regional Fare Collection Strategic Plan. It really is going to allow us to continue this important work with our jurisdictions, as well as seek outside funding. Currently, we have a fantastic support from the state through DRPT for this important effort. So the strategic plan, if you can just want to hop to the next slide. Thank you so much. It does indeed articulate NVTC's vision for an enhanced regionally integrated fare collection system over the next several years. As we all know, technology changes rapidly. So we have a proposed strategic plan that provides flexibility to adapt to changing technology while continuing to maintain our existing fare collection systems. So we just go to the next slide, please. So the strategic plan identifies a series of immediate, near, and long-term activities in which NVTC can support our jurisdictional transit systems in their own efforts, as well as in their efforts to continue their integration with the WMATA fare payment system. The specific actions identified in the plan and on this slide will be used by NVTC to identify funding opportunities to implement the plan and to provide technical assistance to our jurisdictional transit partners and stakeholders. Indeed, I do want to thank Patricia Happ, our program manager, who's leading this region-wide effort through these rapidly changing times, as well as the jurisdictional and transit agency staff that had provided valuable insight and feedback to collaboratively develop this strategic plan. We've incorporated the feedback we received from the Commission at the last month's meeting and are now asking that the Commission accept the new strategic plan. And Patricia is also available online if anybody has any questions.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, you know what? I think we could probably go ahead and get a motion on the floor and then entertain discussion of the motion as well as any questions. So if I could have a motion to approve the resolution accepting our regional fare collection strategic plan.
Madam Chairman,
this is Delegate Reed. So moved.
And I'll second Alcorn.
Thank you, Supervisor Alcorn. Delegate Reed. All right. Any discussion? Questions from Ms. Happ? Implications? Queries about the implications of accepting this plan? We always appreciate accepting a strategic plan that will allow us to take money and grants. Sorry, Supervisor Alcorn. Yeah.
Yeah, just very quickly. This is great. This is awesome. I know one of the challenges I'd love to see us in future efforts similar to this is figuring out a way to quantify customer demand and ridership interest when evaluating these different actions. So I know that's very difficult to measure, but and I don't think we've slipped into this time, but you know, one of the challenges that I think we always have to be aware of is making sure that we're always doing everything in the interests and to the convenience of riders. So, but this looks great. So thank you.
That's a great question. To make sure I understand you, sort of like, to what extent can we quantify the demand for these alternative fare media or universal fare media?
Right, exactly. Now, it seems to be captured in the survey of the transit systems mostly, but there may be at some point in the future a better way to capture the ridership demand and interest.
What an interesting point. Absolutely. Thank you. Ms. Garvey, question.
Yeah, related, and actually it's just a question of curiosity. This is great, and I'm prepared to support it. Could you remind me, Ms. Happ, what state of good repair for the fare boxes? How long, as long as we keep them going, how long do we think they can last? Because I know we'd hoped to replace them a while ago.
Yes, that's correct. So they are actually 15 plus years old, and so they're beyond their useful life. And so the state of good repair project is actually to just keep them running while a new farebox procurement project is underway. And so that project is actually WMATA is developing. They've actually just recently finalized the contract for the new fareboxes, and that is kind of in process right now. So in response to your question, they are just basically being held together with Scotch tape.
And bailing wire, and as long as we've got enough Scotch tape, they might keep limping along. Okay.
Yes. But we do have a good program for putting in the spare parts that need to be to hold them together until they, we have a solution.
They'll, as long as we keep them on life support, they'll keep going. Thank you.
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah, that's what I need. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Mr. Snyder.
Thanks. One quick question. Does this apply to the rail? Because a lot of the narrative refers only to bus. So are we talking about making changes to the rail system or purely the bus system, number one? Number two, have data security and privacy issues been thoroughly vetted as part of this process? Thank you.
Great questions. Yes. So in terms of rail, so most of this, anything that relates to fare boxes, specifically, those are bus fare boxes and BRT, fare boxes. But when we talk about mobile and we talk about Smart Trip, that involves both bus and rail. And then what was your second question?
Related to data security and the flip side of that, data privacy.
Yes, that is something that we're looking at in terms of every single one of our initiatives. It's just been such a, it's something that is definitely on our radar. And I think it's something that we're just, making sure that as we implement each project, we are paying attention and, making sure that we're including those issues and informing everyone and making sure that as designs are implemented that we do have security, privacy, and cybersecurity taken into account.
And one final question: will people be able to use their Smart Trip cards that they currently have for the foreseeable future if you ride rail?
Yes. So while the Smart Trip app provides an additional option, but the Smart Trip cards will continue to be an option for the foreseeable future.
Okay. Thank you very much for great work.
Yeah, thanks for the great questions.
Great. Other questions, comments? Well, it's good to see this work moving forward. Okay, so I think now we've got our motion on the table, we are ready for a roll call vote. Let me turn it over to Ms. Gilchrist to conduct that.
Chair Crystal.
Aye.
Mr. Gary.
Aye.
Mr. Alcorn.
Aye.
Mr. Bell. Ms. Bennett Parker.
Aye.
Mr. Dave Parenti.
Aye.
Mr. Evan. Ms. Filler-Korn.
Aye.
Mr. Faust.
Aye.
Ms. Garvey.
Aye.
Mr. Krizik.
Aye.
Mr. Letourneau.
Aye.
Mr. McKay.
Aye.
Mr. Meyer. Ms. Palchik.
Aye.
Mr. Reed. Mr. Smedberg.
Aye.
Mr. Snyder.
Aye.
Mr. Sullivan.
Aye.
Mr. Turner.
Aye.
And Mr. Walkinshaw.
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you very much. Okay, our next item is an update on the commuter choice program, both the I-66 corridor and the I-395-95 corridor. And I think our presentation is relatively brief, but let me invite Ms. Mathis to share comments.
Indeed. I'm just happy to say, Madam Chair, that staff's provided written updates in the commuter choice program in the materials. And next month, we'll be coming back reporting on the applications that we received for 395 round 2, which the application period closes on January 29th.
All right. Right down the pike. Thank you. All right. Unless there are any questions about that. Okay, I'm going to move us on then to the VRE Express, or the Virginia Railway Express report. Just as a note, you received the VRE minutes in the form of a blue sheeted item. So if anybody has any questions about that, do let us know. We have one VRE action item this month, which is our budget, so an important one. And I'd like to just begin by congratulating our colleague, Ms. Bennett Parker, who was just elected the Operations Board Chairman for 2021. So well, I'm going to invite Mr. Dalton, who's with us, to give a CEO report and then turn it over to Chair Bennett Parker to talk to us about the action item and information item. So Mr. Dalton, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good evening, Commission members and others. As mentioned, you have the VRE update memo in your packet, specifically attachment number 9A, and the CEO report, attachment 9B. So let me just speak to a couple of highlights. I'll be brief here. VRE, we continue to operate at a reduced service level, as what we refer to as our S+ schedule, and we continue to manage and enhance our health and safety measures that we implemented system-wide in 2020. Our ridership for the month of December dipped below 1,000 riders on an average daily basis, primarily due to the holiday season. And our on-time performance for the month of December was 96% system-wide. The majority of VRE staff continues to work remotely, and all of our business functions are fully operational as we continue to maintain a continuity of operations. That is the end of my brief report, Madam Chair.
Thank you. As promised, brief indeed. Okay, so let me turn it over now to our chair, Elizabeth Bennett Parker, for a couple of VRE items.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Commission is being asked to approve Resolution 2436, which will adopt the amended FY21 VRE operating and capital budget and the recommended FY22 VRE operating and capital budget, and refer them to their jurisdictions for the review and adoption. The resolution also authorizes the executive directors of NVTC and PRTC to take necessary actions to apply for federal and state grant funding. The Commission received a detailed presentation on the budget at last month's meeting. Despite the challenges presented by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the recommended budget is balanced with no funding gap and with all projected pieces of funding in FY22 supported by reasonably expected sources of funding. The recommended FY22 operating capital budget totals $185.9 million. The budget includes no change to total subsidy contribution over FY21 levels and also does not include any changes to passenger fares. In September, the Operations Board directed staff to forego the VRE Master Agreement Survey that is normally conducted in October each year. We found that the survey would be challenging to safely administer in the current environment and unlikely to produce reliable results. In place of that, an updated subsidy allocation, we directed staff to allocate the jurisdictional subsidy in FY22 using the same allocation percentages from the approved FY21 budget. Given currently projected ridership levels and the desire to maintain a continuity of operations and high quality service, the board also directed staff to recommend a balanced budget that does not achieve a 50% fare box recovery ratio. The budget achieves balance through the available emergency funding from DRPT and the CARES Act rather than through higher fares or increased jurisdictional subsidy contributions. And then we have one information item as well, which is the Operations Board officers. So at the December 18th meeting, the Operations Board approved nominees for the 21 VRE officers as recommended by the VRE Nominating Committee. In addition to myself as chair, they include Janine Lawson from PRTC as vice chair, our own James Walkinshaw as secretary, and Preston Banks as treasurer representing PRTC. And installation will occur at the January 15th VRE Operations Board meeting, and much like Chair Crystal, I hope to see an in-person meeting this year as well soon. With that, I will turn it back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Great. Okay. All right. Well, I think that unless we have any questions on any of those VRE items for Mr. Dalton or Ms. Bennett Parker. I am going to ask for, actually, Ms. Bennett Parker, I'll turn it back to you to make a motion to approve resolution of adopting and referring the budgets to the jurisdictions.
I would so moved to adopt and refer the budgets to the jurisdictions.
Thank you. We have a second?
McKay, second.
Thank you very much, Mr. McKay. Okay, questions about these budgets? I know we've got VRE's CFO, Mark Schofield, on hand as well to answer any questions about the budget if commissioners have them. All right. Seeing none, I'm sure Ms. Bennett Parker is feeling very validated in her decision to be VRE board chair and not Metro board chair by comparison. It's conversation's much easier. Okay, so seeing none, let's go ahead and have our clerk call the roll for vote.
Chair Crystal.
Aye.
Mr. Gary.
Aye.
Mr. Alcorn. Mr. Bell.
Sorry, aye for Mr. Alcorn, sorry.
Thank you. Mr. Bell. Ms. Bennett Parker. Mr. Jay Ferrenti.
Aye.
Mr. Eben. Ms. Filler-Corn.
Aye.
Mr. Faust.
Aye.
Ms. Garvey.
Aye.
Mr. Krizik.
Aye.
Mr. Letourneau.
Aye.
Mr. McKay.
Aye.
Mr. Meyer. Ms. Pelchik.
Aye.
Mr. Reed. Mr. Smedberg.
Aye.
Mr. Snyder.
Aye.
Mr. Sullivan.
Aye.
Mr. Turner.
Aye.
And Mr. Walkinshaw.
Aye.
The motion passes. I turn it back to the chair.
Thank you. Okay, thanks for hanging with us, everyone. We do have our executive director report. So I'm going to be asking Kate to give some comments. And then as a reminder, we do have a closed session. We'll have that general logistical hurdle of turning off our YouTube feed, et cetera. The content itself for that closed session should be relatively brief. So thank you for hanging in with us. We are in the home stretch. So, forgive me. I'm so sorry. Director Mitchell is not here with us tonight, but did ask Tim Roseboom, whom I saw with us, to give the DRPT report. And I don't mean to rush you at all, Tim, in doing that. Please, if you have comments on behalf of the director and the Department of Rail and Public Transportation, we'd welcome the chance to hear them.
Yes, thank you, Chair Crystal. Yeah, obviously there's a written report. I don't need to reiterate it. The only thing that I would draw the Commission's attention to is that TRPT did adopt an FY21 SIP. The CTB adopted it last month. We had been holding our FY20 funding levels the same, and we actually were able to increase our local operating assistance slightly for 21, and we're also fully funding all of our WMATA obligations, the PREA, the dedicated funding, and then the local jurisdictional match. We're actually able to fund that by an increase of about 15 million that will go to NVTC for the jurisdiction subsidy. So that's it for the DRPT report.
Thank you. I certainly didn't mean to rush past that good news. So glad to see that increase. And thank you so much for your ongoing partnership. We really appreciate you and your colleagues.
Great. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you. And now let me invite Kate with any remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just a reminder for the meetings that we have coming up, we do have that WMATA committee meeting scheduled to meet virtually on January 21st at 6 p.m. And again, the focus of that are really NVTC's comments on the budget development for WMATA's FY22. So I know we'll be bringing some things back to the commission in February. Our meeting is on February 4th. And the other thing is, I hope to be able to give a little bit of update on this at our February meeting. But keep your eyes and ears out for the marketing campaign to encourage folks to come back on transit. It's set to go live later this month on WTOP, WAMU Radio, and their social media sites, as well as a number of different social media sites, as well as on streaming TV services like Hulu. So I'm going to be excited. We're still working very closely on that messaging because, of course, it's a little dynamic right now. And of course, we have our financial reports available for you, as well as my newsletter in the materials. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Mathis. I appreciate that. Okay, we now have a closed session. So for those who are still following along with us on YouTube, we will be returning to open session. The YouTube feed will continue. You'll just see the screen notice that we'll enclose. We are enclosed and that meeting will resume live when we return to open session. If there are any technical difficulties, if that live feed's interrupted, please do check out our YouTube channel or refresh it for a new feed. Okay, commissioners, we will stay on this WebEx link, so no need to hop off and hop on anywhere else. Just stay where you are. The rest of the staff participate.
You're connected. It's just taking a minute for YouTube to catch up. There we go.
Great.
You're good.
All right. So let me begin. I will myself make a motion to certify the closed session. The motion is as follows. The Northern Virginia Transportation Commission certifies that, to the best of each member's knowledge and with no individual member dissenting at the just concluded closed session, first, only the public business matters lawfully exempted from open meeting requirements under the Freedom of Information Act were discussed. And two, only such public business matters as those identified in the motion by which the closed session was convened were heard, discussed, or considered. Do I have a second?
Second. DeFranti.
Great, thank you, Mr. DeFranti. And Ms. Gilchrist will call the roll.
Chair Crystal.
Aye.
Mr. Gary.
Aye.
Mr. Alcorn.
Aye.
Mr. Bell. Ms. Bennett Parker.
Aye.
Mr. Dave Ferrenti.
Aye.
Mr. Eben. Ms. Fuller-Corn.
Aye.
Mr. Faust.
Aye.
Ms. Garvey.
Aye.
Mr. Krizik.
Aye.
Mr. Letourneau.
Aye.
Mr. McKay.
Aye.
Mr. Meyer. Ms. Pelchik.
Aye.
Mr. Reed. Mr. Smedberg. Mr. Snyder.
Aye.
Mr. Sullivan.
Aye.
Mr. Turner.
Aye.
Mr. Walkinshaw.
Aye.
The motion passes. I'll turn it back to the chair.
Thank you all very much. And coming out of closed session, we do have one action item with regard to waiver of a conflict of interest for bond counsel. Let me go to Delegate Sullivan, I think, has a motion for us.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. With regard to the matter discussed in closed session and the recommendation made by counsel, I move that we approve his recommendation.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
Hay, seconds.
Thank you. Unless there is any further discussion, our clerk will call the roll.
Chair Crystal.
Aye.
You should see them on the board.
Aye.
Mr. Gary.
Aye.
Mr. Alcorn.
Aye.
Mr. Bell. Ms. Bennett Parker.
Aye.
Mr. Dave Ferrenti.
Aye.
Mr. Eben. Ms. Fuller-Corn.
Aye.
Mr. Faust.
Aye.
Ms. Garvey.
Aye.
Mr. Krizik.
Aye.
Mr. Letourneau.
Aye.
Mr. McKay. Mr. Meyer. Ms. Pelchik.
Aye.
Mr. Reed. Mr. Smedberg. Mr. Snyder.
Abstain.
Mr. Sullivan.
Aye.
Mr. Turner.
Aye.
Mr. Walkinshaw.
Aye.
The motion passes.
Well, thank you all very much. That is the final item of business to come before the commission in January. Yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted this Jeff McKay. I just want to be recorded as voting aye on the last vote. I think I missed my chance. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got it.
Me as well, Katie. I don't know what's going on when we flipped over. There was a bad connection there.
Okay, great. We've got you as well, Mr. Smedberg. Thank you. All right. Okay, unless there's anyone else we've missed, I think we are ready to conclude our meeting. Without objection, I'll adjourn us. Thank you for participating tonight. The great questions. I look forward to seeing everyone at our next meeting on February 4th and wishing all of our General Assembly commissioners a great start to session.
Thanks very much. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Happy New Year.
Thank you, Katie.
Yeah, thanks, Katie.
Thanks so much.